Hello, fellow gamers. The Elder Scrolls series is considered one of the most successful video game franchises in history. Its works are inspired by the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, George R.R. Martin, and some mythologies of real-world cultures, such as the Norse, the Greek, the Roman, and among others. This documentary will explain the lore behind the series, which is primarily going to be focused on the race of humans. The Elder Scrolls series takes place on the planet Nirn, a faraway distant planet in the known universe, which contains two moons, Secunda and Masser, which some observation would suggest that Secunda is a moon of Masser, and Masser is a moon of Nirn. Anywho, the world of Nirn is said to contain many different races, from elves to Argonians, Khajiit, humans, and as well as others, while most if not all of the series takes place on the continent of Tamriel. Earliest records mentioning human races on the planet Nirn date to the mid-Merethic era, when Atmorians, a human race native to now the frozen tundra of Atmora, began migrating to northern Tamriel, a region later named Skyrim. Most of the human races now inhabiting Tamriel are known to be their descendants. However, when Atmorans began conquering Tamriel, they found Need and Bretons, human races well assimilated into the cultures dominated by elves. During the conquest of Tamriel by the peoples of Atmora, humans already inhabited the whole continent, though Mer were those who ruled it. Mer is a race of elves, and these different races had sub-races such as the Snow Elves, the Dwemer Elves, the Altmer, the Wood Elves, as well as many other different types of elves, and as well as the Dunmer. They were probably the descendants of humans who escaped Atmora looking for a new, better life. It also seems that some humans were aboriginal inhabitants of Tamriel, known as the Needs, and were native to Cyrodiil and Black Marsh. The Needs and the Akaveri could have been the same race, but the names were perhaps changed due to different languages, and some imperial scholars believe that men could have shared the elven homeland of Elenofe and evolved from Aldmer like modern elven races. However, that theory is unlikely since men and Mer have been many different species on the planet Nirn. The most plausible theory on the subject of the origin of the human race was before the First Era on the continent of Akaver, outside Tamriel. The humans were divided into two distinct groups, the Akaveri and the Tishkri, serpent-like men. The lesser race, the Akaveri, were enslaved by these serpent-like men and taught how to farm, fight, smith, and serve. It is possible that these serpent-like men could be the precursor to the Argonians. After a failed revolution by the Akaveri against the Serpent Men, many did escape to Tamriel to set up tribes and villages. This could be the source of the aboriginal tribes in Cyrodiil and the Black Marsh, as well as Skyrim. Windhelm was founded by the humans of Atmoria and is considered the oldest city still occupied in Skyrim, and is the oldest fully fledged human city in all of Tamriel. Hence why Windhelm is nicknamed the City of King. The most significant difference among men and Mer is their lifespan. Unlike the elves, who can live centuries old, human races cannot live more than 100 years naturally. Most die of old age between 60 to 80 years old. It is very easy to tell men from Mer, and visually, as men are more muscular than most elves and have fewer shades of color of their skin. Another easily noticeable feature of Elvenkind is their pointy ears, which men do not have, but most elves do. Some expectations and exceptions to this rule are the Orsimer, known as the Orc, who are very different from other elven races. They resemble other beast-like races such as goblins, who are shorter than most humans, but differences, mentioning that humans rely mostly on non-magical warfare, as they don't have the magical potency of elves. The only exception for this would be the mix of humans and elven races such as the Bretons. Although magicka is used in one form or another by all races, direct magicka and casting of destruction or enchanting spells is considered weak and heretical by men. The snow elves in the area were concerned about the rapid population increase of humans and organized a slaughter in the event which became known as the Night of Tears. In retaliation, Ysgramor gathered an army of 500 companions and mounted an assault on the Snow Elves. This event became known as the Return, and after that event, Atmorans stopped coming into Skyrim from their homeland. Those who stayed are believed to have died as Atmora froze and changed beyond recognition. The Atmorans who left became modern Nords, and those who went west interbred with elves and became Bretons. Those who went south assimilated with the Need and became Imperials. The Needs and Cyrodiil were slaves to the Iliads until the First Era, 243, when Saint Alessia created an uprising and freed them, thus creating the First Empire. According to legend, Ysgramor landed first at Herceric Head at the extreme northern tip of Skyrim's Broken Cape. It is said that he and his companions were fleeing the civil war in Atmora, which at the time had a sizable population, and the Atmorans settled in an area in the future to be known as Winterhold. They eventually built a city in the region and called it Sarthal, and for a long time, relations between the Snow Elves and the Atmorans were somewhat peaceful, until the Snow Elves became concerned about a population problem among the humans. And not long after the Atmorans settled on Sarthal, the Snow Elves led a sneak attack and sacked the city. It is said that only Ysgramor and his sons made it back to Atmora alive. And the variety of accounts as to why this happened, we all assume that the Snow Elves saw the Nords, with their considerably shorter lifespan expectancy and faster rates of physical maturation and expedient reproductive cycle by Elvish standards, would eventually overtake them if left unchecked. Another theory suggests that the sacking of Sarthal was brought on by the Atmoran discovery of the Eye of Magnus beneath the city. Other sources are less certain in their pronouncements, but also point to the focused attack on locations that are of not strategic importance, leading to the theory that the Eye of Magnus, not the extermination of the Nords, was the primary reason for the attack. When Ysgramor and his sons returned to Atmora, they told the stories of the events that occurred in Skyrim, and gathered as many men and women around them for return to settle and to retake Skyrim and avenge the people that lived in Sarthal. After Ysgramor was set to return to Skyrim with an army known as the 500 Companions, composed of the heroes of the Atmoran Civil War, the day of the final passage had begun. The Atmoran Snow Elf War took place in the middle Merethic era, and was the campaign that could be considered indecisive for much of its duration. The battle that decided it for the Atmorans was the Battle of Mosring, and during this battle, the Atmorans were winning, and it appeared that they would be victorious until the arrival of the Snow Prince. He rallied and led his forces into combat, inspiring the troops of the last remaining army of the Snow Elves, before allegedly being killed by a small child. The death of the Snow Prince shattered the morale and motivation of the remaining Snow Elf warriors, and many of these Snow Elves fled into the mountains, and those who remained on the battlefield were killed. The Snow Prince himself was buried with honors by his Nord foes, and the war would end shortly after. And this was followed by a purge of the Snow Elves remaining in Skyrim. The 500 companions, without much resistance, secured the region and laid the foundations for the Ysgramor dynasty. And after the war against the Snow Elves, the 500 companions broke into separate groups to find their way in the newly conquered land. The crew of the Jorvaskr, led by Zeke the River, journeyed around Skyrim until they came upon a mysteriously yet wonderful sight, a monument of a bird whose eyes and beak were opened in flame. This monument became later known as the Skyforge, and it was older than the Snow Elves themselves, and is supposedly as old as Nirn itself. A city was built upon Jorvaskr, and this city became known as Whiterun, with the initial area around it became later known as the Whiterun Hold. Ysgramor and his sons traveled eastward, heading towards Yingal Barrow. After stopping there, Ysgramor's eyes turned to the south, where a river meets the sea. He decreed that his crew would build a great city, and at the monument to the glories of mankind, he would look upon his son's final resting place, and that he had felt his line with no peace in this new home that was never known in Atmora. The city was built along a bridge stretched across the White River, which much of the city made of stone. This city would become known as Windhelm, the City of Kings. When Atmora came to Skyrim, They brought with them their history and cultures, including their religion. Their religion focused the worship on animal gods, and their chief deity was a dragon, just as dragons ruled supreme in Atmora, with dragon priests being their lieutenants, to whom actual governance was left. The same occurred in Tamriel, and at an unknown time, the people of Skyrim rebelled against the dragon overlords. At first, the people died by the thousands. Later, Kine, known as the Nordic goddess of the storm, intervened to help mankind. She gave Parthenax the task of teaching mankind the voice. The tide began to turn in favor of men, and eventually dragons were hunted down, and their cultists that served the dragons were killed or overthrown. And the Atmorans solidified their victory after Hakon One-Eye, Feldir the Old, and Gormlath the Gold-Willed seemingly vanquished the Dragon Lord Alduin, and mankind would survive and win the Dragon War, as many dragons were killed, and the remnants of the cult dispersed and going into hiding, and what was left of the dragon cult built the dragon mounds, and entombed themselves in the remnants of the dragons that lived and died during the war, with the belief that Alduin would one day return and resurrect the faithful. During the First Era, the Snow Elves persisted within the borders of Skyrim until the reign of the 13th of the Ysgramor dynasty, King Harald. At the beginning of the First Era, King Harald was the first to relinquish all holdings in Atmora, proclaiming that the people of Skyrim were an independent people, the first empire of men. Rage the Gifted started the expansion of the First Empire, and this within 50 years of his reign. The Nords ruled all of Skyrim as parts of High Rock, Cyrodiil, and the Dunmer lands of Morrowind. The acquisition of Morrowind was particularly bloody, and still remembered by the Dunmer. The purpose for the formation of the Dwemer Kingdom was to expel the Nords, and in the First Era, 369, High King Borgas was killed during the Wild Hunt. His death led to the start of Skyrim's War of Succession. The War of Succession caused Skyrim's influence to many of its domains to wane, and the hegemony of the Durini took advantage of the internal strife in Skyrim, began taking land in the north and south of High Rock, eventually even claiming portions of Skyrim at certain moments. And in the First Era, 416, the discord produced by the War of Succession greatly weakened the Nords and caused them to be expelled from Morrowind. During the First Battle of the Red Mountain, the Nords would lose all of their territory in Morrowind, and their armies suffered huge casualties at the hands of the Elven Alliance. In the First Era, 420, the Skyrim's War of Succession ended with the Pact of Chieftains and the crowning of Olaf One-Eye as High King. Records indicate that Olaf expanded Skyrim's boundaries when he conquered the Reach, and following Olaf's reign, the Crown of Verity was created to ensure that the Moot would select a ruler worthy enough to rule Skyrim. The Crown caused controversy when it rejected the Moot's choice of king, Asern Icebreaker, and following this rejection, Asern was then killed by Kjorek the White, who took the crown for himself, and relations soured with Cyrodiil when Kjorek rebelled against Emperor Gurius and his Alessian army, but then was killed at the Battle of Sungard in the First Era of 477. His sons and heir, Hoag Merkiller, resented the Alessian order so much that he allied with the Durini hegemony and the King Rislav Loric's insurgents in their war against the Order. Hoag was soon killed at the Battle of Glenobra Moors, and his successor, Wulfharth, continued his predecessor's work and devastating the Alessian Order. High King Wulfharth re-established the Nordic pantheon as the mainstream faith of Skyrim, and drove the Durini hegemony from Skyrim, and waged a war against and united the sons of Skyrim to invade Morrowind and reclaim the heart of Lorkhan. The initial battles for the Nords were so devastating after making landfall, although they thought the Dwemer and the Chimer armies would be weaker, with reports of them warring with each other. They were surprised by the beset by both armies, believing that Shor's army would need all the strength it could muster. Wulfharth had allied himself with Orcish clans and the House of Dagoth in his holy war, much to the vexation of some Nords who still clung to old hatreds. Some tales claim that Vorin Dagoth deceived Wulfharth, and the Nords believing them to be the ally, and betrayed the sons of Skyrim by leading into a combined Dwemer-Chimer army. This army destroyed most of the Skyrim army, and ultimately Wulfharth died at the Battle of Red Mountain, which would be known as the Second Battle of Red Mountain in the First Era 700. It is said that Wulfharth was killed and blasted away into ashes by Vivek. The tribunal wrested Cagrinnick's tools at the heart of Lorkhan from Vorin Dagoth and used them themselves to give themselves divine powers. Unknowing to them, Vorin Dagoth did not die from their conflict, but had secretly connected himself with the heart long ago, turning into Dagoth and becoming a divine himself. During the Second Era, while the Akavari Pentanate saw the decline in distinction and disintegration of much of the Second Empire, Skyrim was the most rebellious provinces in this respect, destroying a fortress at Dawnstar, which catalyzed the Pentanate to crush all large-scale armed forces on Tamriel. During this period, Skyrim maintained most of its own structure, with the Moot continuing to elect kings functionally largely independent of Vuristu, Shay, and his sons. King Logroth was the last High King during the Pentanate and was assassinated in the Second Era 431. Following the assassination, the crown chose his daughter, Freydis, as High Queen. This was disputed by the Jarl of Solitude, who held a partial moot to claim himself High King in the west, signaling the split of Skyrim into two kingdoms. Svartalfheim was unable to keep an influx of orcs fleeing the recent destruction of Orsinium out of his realm, and the chieftain, Yashne Gro Yasku, along with increasingly rebellious Reachmen, was a disruptive presence in the west for several decades. Although some sources claim that this was confined to Falkreath, this was ultimately ended in the Second Era 467, when Hakvild slew Yashnig in single combat. Without a leader, the orcs scattered into the Hrothgarian mountain, and the Second Akavari invasion landed east of Windhelm in the Second Era 572, rather than landing in the east towards Morrowind. The leader was the King of Kamal, and they sacked Windhelm and killed Queen Mabjarn and Nirnhild, her heir. Jorund and her younger son either escaped the sack or was in Riften when it came to Windhelm as the gates fell. And in response to this, the Ebonheart Pact is formed. Jorund rallied his troops across Skyrim, including summoning the spirit of Wulfharth to help the Nords. Following the return, he called himself King Jorund, and the Nords held the Akavari at bay while the Dunmer approached from the east and cornered the Yakavari at Stonefalls, and supplemented by a legion of Argonians, drove the Akavari into the sea. Another account claims that Jorund and Fildgar Strongprince arrived at the battle at the same time, and following the invasion, dueled for the kingship of the eastern Skyrim to avoid civil war. After 3 hours of fighting, Jorund emerged victorious and banished Fildgar, who fled to the Daggerfall Covenant. 10 years after the formation of the Pact, Jorund is noted to be its head as the Skald King, and in 2 Era 852, an allied force of Nords and Bretons occupied the fortress Sancre Tor in the Jural Mountains, north of Cyrodiil, and then was besieged by Talos under the authority of King Cuchulainn and defeated through Breton treachery. Following the battle, the Nords swore allegiance to Tiber Septim and joined the efforts to conquer Cyrodiil. Note that available text regarding the battle did not say that this was the point of where Skyrim joined the Second Empire, merely that Nordic troops joined the Cyrodiilic army. There is no documented account of how or why Skyrim was unified, but it had presumably been a single entity for some time, as the first pocket guide of the Empire suggested when it was published after the Second Era 864, as its division and reunification does not merit a mention in the text. Either that the Imperial Geographic Society had some motive to hide the fact that the kingdom was never divided. It is also likely that Tiber Septim reunified Skyrim through his actions at Sancre Tor. With the years that followed his reunification of Skyrim, Tiber Septim set out to conquer the known world. This campaign became known as the Tiber Wars, known as the Telosian Conquest, and they were a series of wars during the late Second Era in which the Septim Empire led a campaign to conquer every known province and nation of Tamriel. The war started in the second era of 854 and lasted for 42 years, with the end of the Tiber Wars marking the start of the third era, and Tamriel standing united under the imperial banner. When the third era began, Princess Potema, the child of Pelagius II, known as the Tamrielic history as the Wolf Queen, was married to King Mantiarco, known as the King of Solitude. And in the third era, 82, when she was 14, had her first child, Uriel, after many miscarriages. And in the third era, 97, after intervening years, she spent much time gaining the allegiance of other Skyrim nobility. She initially attempted to be made empress herself by forging a letter by her brother, claiming he knew that he was a bastard, and she was discovered. Following this treachery, Potemo and her son Uriel attempted to have her brother's heir, Kintira, declared a bastard before coordinating several attacks on the Empire across Skyrim and High Rock, and it ultimately led to a successful attack on the Imperial City in the Third Era 121. These initial attacks resulted in Empress Kintira's capture in the Third Era 121 and the execution of Glenpoint Castle in High Rock, and Uriel proclaimed himself Emperor Uriel Septim III. This would later trigger the War of the Red Diamond. The War of the Red Diamond lasts 6 years between rival claimants, and Uriel was captured at the Battle of Iddig at Hammerfell, 3rd Era 127, and killed by a mob while en route to Cyrodiil for trial. Following this, Potemo's allies had deserted her and swore loyalty to Sepphoris, while Potemo summoned Daedra and raised undead to serve her dwindling armies in the next years. After a 3-year-long siege of her castle in Solitude, the Wolf Queen was declared dead. In the Third Era 137, at the beginning of the 5th century of the Third Era, Uriel's 6th reign was an overall stable one, but was dotted by occasional strife and near catastrophe. His imperial battle mage, Yarger Theron, possibly at the urging of Mehrunes Dagon, imprisoned him and ruled in his stead for several years. The Emperor escaped just in time to thwart an attempt by the King of Wayrest to conquer Daggerfall. By the time of Dagoth threw Morrowind into crisis, there was talk of failing health of the Emperor and concerns over the future of the Empire. During this time, Wolf, an avatar of Tiber Septim, appeared and spoke about the Empire's rulership needing a change. Only a few years later would Wolf's words turn into reality. As it turned out, the Emperor's health was not an issue, until the assassin prevented him from fleeing the Imperial City. After learning of the murder of every known heir to the throne, their murders, as it turned out, was done by a cult known as the Mythic Dawn that served Mehrunes Dagon and were preparing Tamriel for an invasion by the Daedra Lord. Thus began the Oblivion Crisis, and it began with Mehrunes Dagon's attempt to enter Tamriel in his true and terrible form. Oblivion gates opened up all over Tamriel, and a massive war between mortals and Daedra ensued. Though most of the fighting took place in Cyrodiil, it is known that the Oblivion Gates all opened all across Tamriel, including the Somerset Isles, High Rock, Morrowind, and as well as Skyrim, and Septim's sole illegitimate heir, Martin Septim, closed shut the jaws of Oblivion by metamorphosing into an avatar of Akatosh and defeating Dagon, sacrificing himself for the Empire, and the Empire was left without an heir once more, but this time with no remaining legitimate Septim inherit. The Elder Council, which had essentially ruled during the periods of the weakest empires, assumed absolute authority, and this began many provinces' succession and dissolving of the Empire, Blackmarsh being the first. Thus would begin the Fourth Era. During this Fourth Era, and at the beginning, the Septim Empire had gone heavy changes, both culturally and politically. The death of Martin Septim and the end of the Oblivion Crisis marked the end of the Septim dynasty, only to be led by the Mede dynasty. The Elder Council continued to rule 15 years after the death of Chancellor Octo, igniting a civil war in Cyrodiil. It ended when Colovian warlord Titus Mede I conquered the imperial city and took what was left of the empire. When Titus Mede took the throne, the empire was nothing like what it used to be. The provinces of Blackmoor succeeded the empire following the Oblivion Crisis, and Morrowind was largely destroyed by the Red Mountain during this time, with only the most western portion being ruled by the Dunmer, and in the south being taken over by the now independent Argonians, who overthrew their Dunmer overlords. In the wake of the Oblivion Crisis, the Thalmor convinced the Altmer of Somerset Isles of being their saviors from the Daedra invasion, and consolidated their power. In the Fourth Era 29, the governments of Valenwood was overthrown by the Thalmor collaborators, and a union of Eleanor proclaimed. Thus the Aldmeri Dominion was reborn. Leyawiin and Breville became independent city-states and were constantly at war with one another. Elsewhere had declared independence and turned into the ancient kingdoms of Anaquinia and Palatine. The Empire's ineffectual protection seemed indifference to Morrowind's plights, made them to be reviled by the Dunmer. After the Empire released its grasp on Morrowind, House Lalu, the last imperial ally in the province, was ousted from the Grand Council, and Morrowind left the Empire, as had Hammerfell, and additionally supplied that High Rock had also left the Empire, leaving it Skyrim and most of Cyrodiil. During the rule of Titus Mede I, though, Breville and Leyawiin were reclaimed. Hammerfell was also reconquered, and if High Rock did leave the Empire, High Rock was also reclaimed, and under his leadership, the rebels in Valenwood were also supplied by the Pentilus Oculatus. Under later emperors, Elsewhere was presumed to have been reclaimed, though Elsewhere was also lost again during the Void Nights of the Fourth Era, 98. The status of Morrowind's affiliation with the Empire is questionable, as they had full autonomy and appeared to have little love for the Empire anyway. Furthermore, the Anaxel's invasion of Morrowind during the Accession War prevented the Empire from reclaiming Morrowind, and during the Void Nights, the Thalmor claimed that they had restored the moons, unknown previously to the Dawn Magics, but it is unclear if they really truly restored the moons or just took the advantage of the foreknowledge that they would return. Regardless of whether the Thalmor spoke truly or not, the Khajiit credited the Thalmor as their saviors, and 15 years later, imperial influence in Elsewhere had diminished so much that the Empire was unable to stop a coup in the Fourth Era 115 and dissolved the Elsewhere Confederacy and recreated the ancient kingdoms of Anaquinia and Palatine as client states of the Aldmeri Dominion. Sometime before the Great War had begun, the Blades began a shadow war against the Thalmor, believing that the Thalmor were a threat to mankind and the Emperor. Believing that they were superior enough to handle the conflict, they attempted to stop the Thalmor. However, this arrogance led to the destruction of the Blades, and in response to their aggression, the Thalmor systematically hunted down and exterminated every single member of the Blades in all parts of Tamriel. The remaining members of the Blades that were in hiding in Skyrim and at the outbreaks of Skyrim Civil War hid for their own lives, and it is suggested that the Thalmor would have destroyed the Blades eventually in any case, since they saw the Blades' connection to Talos as a possible threat. By the time of the Great War, the Empire was only a shadow of its former self, and on the 30th of Frostfall, 4th Era 171, the Aldmeri Dominion sent an ambassador to the Imperial City with a gift and a covered cart for an ultimatum for the new Emperor, Titus Mede II. The long list of demands, including staggering tributes, dismantling of the Blades, outlawing the worship of Talos, and giving large sections of Hammerfell to the Dominion. Despite the warnings of his general, the Empire's military weakness, Emperor Titus Mede II rejected the ultimatum, and the Thalmor ambassador upended the cart, spilling over 100 heads on the floor, for every Blades agent in Somerset and Valenwood had been executed. So thus began the Great War, which would consume the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion for the next 5 years. This Great War was brutal and very bloody, only to be outmatched on the scale by the Oblivion Crisis. The Aldmeri Dominion had almost nearly defeated the Empire, and conquering or annexing former provinces in their domain. But the final battle between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion took place in the Imperial City, in which the entire Dominion army was decimated by the Empire. After achieving this great victory, the Empire was ready to begin negotiations once again. But due to the insurmountable, irreplaceable, and devastating losses that the Empire had suffered, including large swaths of territory that they could not win the war, with the Aldmeri Dominion seemingly preparing another invasion, Titus Mede brought the Dominion back to the table for talks, and by only signing the White Gold Concordant was the Empire able to survive the Dominion's onslaught and thus end the Great War. The Concordant led to the loss of Hammerfell and southern parts, which would have been handed over to the Dominion if not the Red Guard's uprising anyway. The northern part of Hammerfell, which had been warring with the Dominion since the Second Treaty of Stros-Makal, was declared a truce between the Dominion and Hammerfell, resulting in the former's forces to withdraw, thus concluding that the Hammerfell became independent from the Empire and was able to rule in its entirety unto itself. With the White Gold Concordant was immediate and the banishing of Talos worship. During the Great War against the Aldmeri Dominion, Ulfric was taken captive by the Dominion and interrogated. During this interrogation, Ulfric Stormcloak was made to believe that he had divulged information which led to the fall of the Imperial City before being allowed to escape. Thalmor sources imply that they kept some degree with contact with Ulfric Stormcloak following his escape. And at the end of the war, in the Fourth Era 175, Emperor Titus Mede II signed the White Gold Concordant, and the terms of treaty included the banning of Talos worship. Following the signing of the White Gold Concordant, the Reach in Skyrim was in disarray, taken over by the native Breton people in the Reach called the Reachmen. They took this opportunity to seize control of the city of Markarth, and this was only possible as the Imperial Legionnaires stationed in Markarth were called to fight the Great War in Cyrodiil, leaving the city largely vulnerable. After the Great War had ended, Wulfdir and his son Igmund and their Imperial colleagues sought help from Ulfric Stormcloak in ousting the Reachman invaders. They promised Ulfric that if he retook the Reach, then Wulfdir as Jarl would allow the free worship of Talos, an act that was recently outlawed at the end of the war. Ulfric had agreed, and he marched his militia to the gates of Markarth and ruthlessly retook the city using the power of his Thu'um. Ulfric led a force of militia to retake the Reach, which had declared independence under the Forsworn during the Great War. Ulfric had held the city, but refused to surrender it to the Imperial Legion until they agreed to allow Talos worship once again. And for a time following this, Talos worship was restored, though in secret. When the Dominion found out, they pressed the Empire to enforce its ban. With Ulfric feeling betrayed by the Empire, he planned to overthrow the High King and declare Skyrim's independence. There, Ulfric, Jarl of Windhelm, challenged Skyrim's High King, King Torygg. He killed High King Torygg with the help of the Thu'um. Although Ulfric's claims the shout merely knocked him to the ground, and some claim that this was murder and an attempted coup. Many in Skyrim believe that Ulfric's Thu'um tore Torygg's body into unrecognizable pieces, and Ulfric, however, states that the duel was an honorable duel, in keeping with Nordic tradition. With the death of Torygg, Ulfric led his followers into civil war, pitting the Empire's loyal Jarls against Ulfric's loyal forces, who became the Stormcloaks. Thus, a bitter and bloody civil war waged for a time, after which later Ulfric would be captured along with his trusted lieutenant Ralof of Riverwood, a horse thief named Lukir of Rorikstead, and an unnamed prisoner who would later become the Dragonborn. During the execution process, Alduin, the Nordic god of destruction, a dragon, returned to Tamriel. His first known action was after his return was attacking a small mountain town, Helgen, coincidentally interrupting the execution of several prominent figures, among them Ulfric Stormcloak, his lieutenant Ralof, and the unnamed prisoner. Alduin had later, after devastating Helgen, flew into the northern lands. Alduin subsequently began resurrecting fallen dragons across the region. Notably, this dragon would become in conflict with many people of Skyrim. One dragon in particular, was awoken and laid siege to a tower near the city of Right One. After guards reported a dragon attacking the city's western watchtower, the prisoner, having arrived there themselves, was tasked alongside a contingent of guards to meet the end of the threat. After the battle, the force eventually defeated the dragon, and the defeat in dragon revealed that the prisoner was in fact the Dragonborn, a legendary warrior with the body of a mortal and the soul of a dragon. After this event, a mysterious order known as the Greybeards summoned the newly minted Dragonborn to their monastery for training. The Greybeards conducted several various training exercises with the Dragonborn to train them in the ways of the voice. And due to the Dragonborn's astonishing ability to learn the voice faster than any other human previously before them, eventually sent them out on a mission to retrieve the horn of Jargon Windcaller, which was located in an ancient Nordic burial crypt of Justengraf. However, the horn had already been taken by another party, leading the Dragonborn back to the town of Riverwood. While in Riverwood, the Dragonborn meets up with one of the last member of the Blades, and turns out the thief would be revealed to be the innkeeper, Delphine. She explained to the Dragonborn that she had the knowledge of several dragon burial sites littered across Skyrim, some of which had been found empty. She believed that the dragons were being resurrected, and that the next resurrection would happen in a small settlement in Kynesgrove. Thus requested the Dragonborn follow her there to gain further information and avert another attack. Delphine explained to the Dragonborn that the Blades were once an organization dedicated to slaying dragons, and they were the original dragon slayers, and that the original Dragonborn at that time led the Blades to help destroy all the dragons during the First Era. After arriving at Kynesgrove, Alduin was observing hovering over the burial site, speaking in the ancient dragon language. Another dragon rose out of the earth and openly mocked the Dragonborn, calling them arrogant in the name of the Dova. Alduin then ordered the other dragon to slay the mortals and flew away. This other dragon began to attack Delphine and the Blades, and her suspicions that the Thalmor were responsible for the recent dragon uprising. The Dragonborn, when he slew the dragon, proved to Delphine that he was truly the Dragonborn of legend. And when the Dragonborn investigated the Thalmor to determine if they were the ones who summoned Alduin, the investigation revealed the opposite, that the Thalmor alone were seeking answers just the same, and they were namely tracking down another blade, the archivist Esbern. The Dragonborn reached him first and led him back to Delphine. Esbern explained his knowledge on the dragon's return and the new information on ways to fight them. Delphine, Esbern, and the Dragonborn then traveled to the ancient blade stronghold, known as Sky Haven Temple, where they discovered Alduin's wall. Through the wall, they deciphered what ancient Nord warriors used, in conjunction with an Elder Scroll, a shout, to defeat Alduin. Unfortunately, during this time, vampires were running rampant across Skyrim at night, killing people and feeding at will. Thus, to combat this, the Vigilant of Stendar decided to try to stop the vampires. But a man named Isron broke with the group to form the Dawnguard after they refused to heed his warning that the Empire threat was larger than it appeared. When the Dragonborn learned of the Dawnguard, he set out to find them. And during this time, the vampires, at the behest of Harkon, looked for his daughter. The Dragonborn also tasked to finding what the vampires are searching for, coming across the daughter of Coldharbour, Serana. She is the daughter of Harkon and one of his first true vampires, transformed by Molag Bal. It is said that her transformation into vampire was done by Molag Bal himself, hence the moniker, the daughter of Coldharbour. Once the Dragonborn finds Serana, he learns over time that Serana was hidden by her mother with an Elder Scroll to prevent Harkon from bringing true a prophecy written by a snow elf named Archcurate Verther, one of the last surviving snow elves, who was afflicted with vampirism in the Merethic era. The Dragonborn, along with Serana, set out across Tamriel to find Ariel's bow and use it to stop Harkon. And in the final battle with Harkon, Serana renounces her father, and the Dragonborn shoots a sun-helled arrow at Harkon, killing him, thus ending the vampire problem in Skyrim. After the vampire threat was over, the Dragonborn then went back to Riverwood, and upon returning, he was ambushed by a cult known as the Cult of Mirak. This cult, who was sent by another Dragonborn named Merethic, began his return to Tamriel and sent assassins to kill the Dragonborn, which they failed. Thus, during the Dragon Crisis, the Dragonborn set out the Solstheim to stop him, freeing the peoples of Solstheim and the Skald from the Influence Stones. After making a deal with a Daedric lord named Hormaeus Mora, he was able to defeat Merethic on the summit of Apocrypha and returned to Tamriel to finish his quest to stop Alduin. When he returns to the Greybeards, he is then granted audience to a dragon known as Parthenax, who is the one who taught humans the voice. And he tells the Dragonborn that in order to stop Alduin, they must capture a dragon. And the only town to do this that is capable of capturing a dragon is Whiterun. So he goes to Whiterun and gets help to capture the dragon at Whiterun and uses the dragon that he captured to ride to a Nordic ruin that can send the Dragonborn to Sovngarde in order to stop Alduin from feasting on the souls of the dead. There in Sovngarde, he teams up with the Legends of Skyrim and defeats Alduin during the Battle of Sovngarde. After the battle, the rest of the dragons leave Skyrim to a place of seclusion, and it is said at the conclusion of the Skyrim Civil War, the Thalmor and Aldmeri Dominion would take the threat of mankind more seriously. Thus began a second great war. During this time, no matter who had won the Civil War in Skyrim, they would have to unite with the Empire to fight the common foe to prevent the extinction of all mankind. It is unknown if the Second War would occur after the Dragon Crisis, and if it does, many would wonder who would win. Regardless of the outcome, the end of the Second War would bring about the Fifth Era, which would either be called the Era of Mankind or the Era of the Elves and the Aldmeri Dominion, respectively. The Tale of Men is written in the stories of all the Elder Scrolls series that has ever been released from 1994 to the present. The Elder Scrolls series is expected to release another game sometime within the next 5 years. This Elder Scrolls 6 could be the location, and this 6th installment might bring to a close the conflict between Men and Mer and bring about the 5th era during Tamriel's history. Well, thank you for watching and thank you for subscribing. If you haven't done so, please subscribe to my channel, Iron Tusk 341, and click that alert button when you could be alerted to my next documentary. You could also check out my live stream Elder Scrolls series on my YouTube channel. But as always, thanks for watching.